Thank you. Although I'm not even revered in my own home, David. I've thought a lot about what I want to talk about here, and I think that the thing that perhaps is most interesting is to talk about the way that what I try to do mostly is create an environment for creativity for other people. I do that as a producer. I do that for that somewhat pretentious word, dramaturg, trying to unleash the creativity of other people. And I therefore spend a lot of time thinking about what that is, how that can work, why we do it, and what are the obstacles to it. And I thought that I'd focus on a small anecdote today and then try to maybe enlarge that and think about a couple of the consequences of it. And to do that, going back a quarter of a century and using an example that many of you will know of, which is Tony Kushner's Angels in America, which I commissioned and developed about 25 years ago over the course of a number of years. And Tony and I had become friends. I directed and produced his first professional production, A Bright Room Called Day, which was a wonderful play, still is a wonderful play. Incredibly smart, incredibly gorgeous writing. Aristotle says the gift for metaphor is the one thing that can't be taught, and Tony has had that from the beginning. Amazingly interesting characters, terrifically high-stakes situation, the 6 months before Hitler took power to the 6 months after, that year in Berlin, with a group of artists, radicals, gay activists going through that 12 months together. And yet something about the play didn't entirely click. For all of that brilliance, what we had at the end was a successed esteem. We didn't have something that really ignited with the audience. And what Tony and I discussed, what was clear, is that the thing that was perhaps subdued in that play was people actually changing, characters changing. We read the poetics again, we discussed this, and we knew, and Tony did it like most playwrights who are serious playwrights, he was grudging and resentful about the demand for people to change. Because we, of course, watch in all of our Hollywood dramatizations, characters are changing all the time. It's not like those guys who are making films for 12-year-olds didn't go to graduate school at Brown. They all know the poetics, they all know, but it's treated as a formula, simply a set of paces to put stick figures through and to put an audience through, where we will give you the simulacrum of change. We will give you the feeling that change has happened, but nothing will actually change. And so every serious playwright I know struggles with this idea of change. But Tony knew that this is what had to happen. So we commissioned a play. He had a great title, Angels in America. That's a great title. We got a grant from the federal government, the National Endowment for the Arts. This was before the culture wars. The National Endowment for the Arts gave a grant to Tony, to an individual artist, to write this play. It's important to say that publicly as often as possible. So made possible by government support. We had the actors of the Eureka Theater Company. We had this wonderful actor who'd been to NYU with Tony named Stephen Spinella, who he also wanted to be in the play. Come on board, Stephen, started to write it. Tony started to work on it. We talked, he worked, he talked, he worked. And at a certain point, he came to me, maybe 6 months, 7 months into the process, and he'd been sending me scenes, beautiful stuff, beautiful pages. And he said, Oscar, I've got a problem. I can't get these people to change fast enough. And, this was the last moment in my personal biography where I could adopt a patronizing tone to Tony Kushner. And I said to him, oh, Tone, this is simply because, self-indulgence, you're just getting the first draft out. It says, this will all change. But he thought otherwise, and he proposed that perhaps we should consider this a 2-evening show. Well, my tiny little theater company in San Francisco doing a 2-evening show by an unknown playwright about AIDS was just not going to fly. And I told him so. And I lost that argument. And thank God I lost that argument, because he convinced me that this difficulty in these characters changing was actually the crucial content of the piece. And he took that formal difficulty, and what happened is he changed that formal difficulty into actually what the core content of Angels in America is. And when you look at Angels now, what it's about is how incredibly difficult it is to change. What it's about is how much like death change feels like. But change isn't death. Change is necessary. And so 6 years later, we had as finished as it'll ever be, Angels in America. 6 years, 7 hours. And that length became actually part of the artistic strategy for demonstrating change. Because by being that long, first of all, by the time the characters changed, you believed in the change in a way that had nothing to do with going through paces. He had actually described the way people change, which is the core of our art form, how people change. And he had taken the time necessary to do it in terms of the audience going through it. He also, by making it 2 parts, had created something that couldn't be consumed like a regular commodity. You notice how we're all happy now when the theater's really short? Oh, good, 80 minutes. Because we're all happy when we can get some kind of nice wrapped around commodity that we can buy and have our dinner and go home. This resists that, rebels against it, indeed destroys the idea that you can consume this work of art like a commodity. And that in itself is part of the strategy. And the creative strategy, it literally took 6 years to write. And what became clear is that part of my job was being a producer, part of my job was being a dramaturg, which simply meant the guy who kept talking to Tony about every aspect of the piece all the way down. He just described me as it was written in conversation with me. What flattery for me to think that. But the other part is that it was my job to do everything necessary to allow 6 years to pass before it was done, to get the grants to block down field for that running back and make sure that he had the time and space to let change actually happen. Because that's what the theater is. And it's why the theater doesn't want to be a commodity. The art form doesn't want to be a commodity. It resists that. And it's why it vanishes. Peter Brook was once asked, aren't you upset that none of your shows last? And he said, well, at least we don't clutter up the museums. And the thing that he meant by that I think is worth talking is we think somehow that something that's an object is realer because it's an object. But actually, it's less real because it's an object. Because we die. We're temporary. Nothing about our life is actually going to last. The realest thing is change. The realest thing we have is the moment, is the relationships. And those relationships happen and they pass. And the theater is an art form that completely embraces and recognizes that. It's the most real. It's the most like life there is. So what are the obstacles to that? The attempts to turn it into a commodity. And what's the biggest way to resist turning something into a commodity? Is don't put a price on it. Make it free. That's what Joe Papp understood 55 years ago when he made Free Shakespeare in the Park. And the challenge that those of us who have succeeded him have is that is now viewed as it's under glass. It's like, oh, sure, it works as it's free because it's Shakespeare in the Park. It's free because it's Shakespeare. It's free because it's outdoors. It's free because that's an institution. Not the fact that it's free is of the essence of what keeps it from becoming a commodity. And I'm going to finish with just a thought which I could expand on at great length, but I won't, which is that really what we have is a condition in our society where the art, the theater, wants to be free, and in order for that to happen, we need to have an economic system that pays the artists. We need to make the artists be paid and the art be free. And instead, what we have is a system that makes the art more and more expensive and the artists less and less supported. And we've got it backwards, as we have so many other things. And as a producer, as a guy, not just a producer, as a guy who cares about the American theater, that feels like the challenge that I face every day, is how do we put a spoke in the wheel of that particular progress and reverse it and try to get the other way around. So, thank you.